of the International Association of Aesthetics many years ago in Tokyo. Parul Mukherji is professor of art history at the School of Arts and Aesthetics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, India. Her doctoral thesis at Oxford University involved bringing out a critical edition of a classical Sanskrit text, the Sitra Sutra of the Vishnu Harmotara Purana. Sorry. Recent publications include Influx, Contemporary Art in Asia of 2013, Wider Art History in a Globalizing World, and Art History and its Discontents in Global Times, both of 2014. And finally, Rethinking Aesthetics in a Comparative Frame of 2020. Her current interest is in decolonizing art history and aesthetics via the theory of Anukarana Vada, or performative mimesis. I think I postponed the introduction of Abidoun Akande, and will do it if he will join us. As we can see, Parul is a perfect contributor to our topic. Thanks once again, dear Parul, for joining us and enriching our discussion. Having said that, I want to hand over to Judith Siegmund for the first talk.
Maybe one thing, just I didn't say anything about how we're going to proceed. I'm sorry, I should have said that before. We are going to have 5 presentations by all the panelists, 5 brief presentations following each other. First by Judith Siegmund, then Michaela Ott, then Abidoun Akande, then Marita Tatari, and then Parul Mukherji, and then we will start the discussion. So we have about an hour of presentations now, starting with Judith. You're muted. You're muted. We can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I will start with a very long title. It is On the Reflexive Form of Judgment as a Recognition Generating World Reception Mode at 18th Century Mentality and Criticism of it Today. The idea of a sensus communis, or common sense, as cited by Shaftesbury, for instance, touches on the necessity of divided feelings and values, as it is only through these that a society can be thought of at all as a cohesive social unit. Kant took the divided feeling of English empiricism and made of them a communal shared sense of judgment of human faculties, always retaining the thought of a divided communal hidden agenda in the background. From today's perspective, the communal exists in the tension with the foreign, with that which is excluded from it. I will therefore begin with the historical shadow side of the simultaneous exclusion and inclusion of the colonized foreign in the assertion of a universal human capacity. As Achille Mbembe remarks, a marking of the absolutely foreign may owe its existence to the subject's own inner exotism as a concept of the foreign. An exotism of this type is considered by Mbembe to be one possible variety of racism. If one thinks about it from this perspective, a European history of aesthetics cannot be without a sense of guilt in being confronted with an extra-European aesthetic or sensual experience, as if it could simply open itself up to it or simply inform itself about it. Mbembe emphasizes that the dismemberment of Black slaves took place from the perspective of a functionalistic operation in the epoch of Enlightenment, in which the bodies of the colonized were regarded only as functioning organs to be deployed and made efficient in the name of a capitalist maximization of usefulness. This type of bridge or connection, which connects the general concept of emancipation with its own shadow side, cannot simply be shaken off by according the foreign a due place in one's own concept of equality. According to Mbembe, the unwholesome connection in the past consists in the fact that Europe and the history of its thought and its aesthetic, as Mbembe says, are founded upon the principles of race. Conversely, the aesthetic of the colonized cannot be determined as an experience and concept that was previously repressed and can now simply and readily be recognized. The racist marking has been inscribed upon it by Europe. Thus, we come to the question of the authoritarian definition of an anthropological assumption of equality of all human beings in the 18th century in the light of the question of racism and the question of an implicit dismemberment and subdivision of the so-called equal human beings. What role then does aesthetics play in this scenario extending from the 18th century to our own time? What role did aesthetic understanding, aesthetic attitude, and aesthetic judgment play in the course of this division of the world, in the course of this European assumption of the right of annexation, domination, torture, and exploitation? With a view to Kant and the implications of the 18th century, I think that aesthetics and the aesthetic theory of sensus communis, its invoking of a common or communal sense, Gemeinsinn, served a function of exoneration, Entlastung in German. Who was it who was exonerated? Exposure of aesthetic judgment exonerated those who benefited from the dark side of world subjugation. European men and women, as those subjects.
Judith, I'm sorry. You keep hitting the microphone, I think, with your manuscript. It's very noisy, so sorry.
What? Sorry. Okay. Where we are. Also, European men and women as those subjects who enjoyed and consumed. This hypothesis, however, would require to be elucidated with the aid of the basic aesthetic categories and not only historically. The sensus communis of the reflexive aesthetic judgment of taste, just like the teleological reflexive judgment, rests upon a heuristic imputation. In the case of aesthetic judgment, the imputation is, this object is beautiful. The redeeming Einlösung of this judgment takes place by way of an examination of one's own feelings and pleasure of or displeasure. The expectation that everyone else will also feel the same way as the person making the judgment is based upon a decoupling of aesthetic judgment from its cognitive examination as knowledge. European aesthetic judgment is connected with the figure of not wanting to know, as Mbembe calls. To phrase it another way, it is only because I do not want to know who built the palace and under what circumstances that I can judge it to be beautiful, and in this I am concerned entirely with myself only. Aesthetic judgment and the aesthetic attitude thus enables and supports the ignorance of the racist flip side of global capitalist economies, which are what makes so many beautiful objects, such as palaces or other lands, available to me in the first place. At the same time, precisely such a reflexive formation of a judgment is given as its own form of knowledge in aesthetic theory. To be more specific, knowledge in this case does not mean the special being subsumed into the general. Instead, knowledge in this case owes a depth to describing the way that judgments of understanding rest upon the forms of inner conceptual images. Aesthetics can tell us something about the fundamental manner in which knowledge arises in all people, From this derives the ideal of equality and the anthropological assumption of a principle of equality that applies to all human beings. It is therefore extremely complicated, as the foundation stone of the concept of equality is not in itself innocent. Fundamentally, it goes hand in hand with an ignorance of exploitation and racism. The exploited, tortured, and dismembered subjects are recognized in retrospect as members of a shared class. What can we infer from this dilemma? And why should the reflexive knowledge form not to be regarded as being in itself guilty? Today, in my opinion, the question of common sense does not derive from the comfortable thought of recognizing the capacity of all human beings from a European or Western perspective as a result of globalization. This now has to be faced in a different way. Climate change and the pandemic forced this question up in us on a functional and ethical level. Aesthetics must also be active in this setting. It cannot claim an exceptional status that proclaims freedom only for the aesthetic attitude of all subjects, either from the perspective of engagement with its past from the 18th century onwards or with regard to the current conditions of global exploitation and climate extremes. The thought, what I would wish to connect myself with all other human beings by, for instance, assuming that they find the same object to be beautiful, is, in my opinion, an important thought, and one that says something about sociality and the creation of public space between human beings. This must connect with questions concerning a systematic of the faculty of empathy or empathies. In my opinion, it is only when I connect the social nature of all human beings with a universal faculty for developing moral feelings that a recourse to something shared and communal can theoretically be created. A similar intuition was produced by English empiricism, for instance, in the work of Shaftesbury. It was through Kant that the sociality of moral feelings was first reinterpreted into a universality of human cognitive capacity. Kant says that clarity or imagination is a factor at play in cognition. By saying this, he expresses the fact that the heuristic of judgment possess a significant position in our recognition formation. Such a definition does not inevitably lead to reflexive distance and aesthetic freedom as a comfort zone in which one could indifferently absolve oneself of all responsibility. It is not solely a matter of reflexive recognition. Instead, question of production aesthetic must also be included. This means that it does in fact make a difference who builds a palace and under what circumstances. Thank you very much.
Michaela, will you take over? And I'm glad you're here, Abidoun. We made a round of introductions, but Michaela did not introduce you yet because you weren't there, and she will do so after her talk, I would say, just before yours. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Michaela, du bist auch noch stumm. Man hört dich nicht.
Okay. My talk is on aesthetics, a European knowledge mode again. Aesthetics is not only a discipline developed in the European Enlightenment, but the result of cultural parameters that include assumptions on the particularity of the person and on the person's divisible capacities, which can be treated in an equally weighted way, and assumptions on the beauty of aesthetic proportions in artworks and their ideal presentation and reception forms. The fact that artworks are displayed in spaces of protection, where they can develop their mythic autonomy, is part of the West's individual-centered focus, a condition for the possibility of an artwork's single appropriation by detached persons and artworks' receptive commodification. This is to this day understood quite differently, for the most part not in the global South. These parameters of understanding are criticized vehemently today by the theorists of the Southern Hemisphere. For this reason, we cannot speak of a sensus communis that exists regardless of culture. The presumed aesthetic sensitivity, the implied knowledge, and even the wish to ascribe the same judgment of taste to everyone must be understood as an inadmissible enterprise of generalization. It comes as no surprise that using the terms epistemic imperialism or cognitive empire, certain African theorists demand a decolonization of mind, a contribution of the others, and a discussion on the understanding of person, artwork, and artifact, and the possibilities of communality. Today, every aspect of the sensus communis concept, from Kant's judgment of taste, is open to criticism. Not only is it based upon an assumption of a self-evident aesthetic experience that withholds the possibility of other sensitivities and ways of perception, but it also disregards the standardized norms of the preferred artwork and does not reflect the associated historical knowledge. This model of automatic recognition in the communal mode, leading to judgments on what is beautiful in art, is nowadays criticized by philosophers and art historians such as Parul Mukherji from India and Abidoun Akande from Nigeria. I quote Deleuze: "Recognition makes a claim for a subjective principle of the working together of capacities for everyone, a community spirit as concordia facultatum, the being together of the faculties. And at the same time, the identity form of the object makes a claim to be a ground of the unity of a thinking subject." End of quote. Deleuze calls this Kantian conception the two halves of the doxa, of a dogmatic knowledge. It does not stimulate processes of thinking about that which may be different and worthy of reflection, or of a remodeling of aesthetic sensitivity. This is why this static model was set into motion by the German Romantic movement. For Novalis, the individual is already conceived of as a individual and inner heterogeneity. This brings us to the following question: how can the epistemic base that allows the opening up of the possibility of shared aesthetic experience, in spite of different perceptions, be expanded? Is there a post-colonial mode of speech regarded as a series of different statements about the shared aesthetic experience, in which vertical universality can be subtracted, and in line with the wishes of the Senegalese philosopher Souleymane Bachir Diagne, infinite lateral transferal would be the goal? The desire to connect with others, which you, Judith, have quite correctly emphasized, and to reach agreement on what makes us experience objects as beautiful or relevant, is a meaningful one. So how can we speak about aesthetics and knowledge in a culturally transversal and differentiated way when Western art history, aesthetic norms, and modes of financialization are still dominant, forcing artists from the global South to relate to them, to parody or modify them? Post-colonial authors ask for the recognition of hybrid or culturally composite art practices of the global South, and emphasize that the aesthetic tension and cultural deviation involved in these artworks should be perceived and appreciated. It seems to me that today all art productions that wish to appear on a globalized stage can be said to orient themselves on artistic models of different cultural origin, which means they are inescapably partaking, parted, and imparted as Clisson states. Today we are dealing more and more often with the commonality of processes of partaking, with an aesthetic practice of being together apart, which can be considered an alternative to the generalized aesthetic judgment. I call this practice aesthetic dividuation. This dividuation model is also led by the thought that we as people are not undivided entities, not individuals, but psychophysically interwoven with other life forms and practices in the bio and sociological, the cultural and media spheres. We are necessarily dividuated. It is a precondition for our being capable of subject modelings, something that Marita Tatari will speak about. The porous boundary between person and sociality, especially in indigenous cultures, are emphasized today by anthropologists such as Merlin Southern, Viveros de Castro, Ariun Apadurai, and Abidoun Akande in the use of the term individual. It seems to me that this assumption of the person constituted through interference with diverse others, and at the same time particular in its mode of partaking, applies to inhabitants of the northern and southern hemisphere in equal measure today. This commonality is nevertheless expressed more often in artistic practices of the global south. In this sense, I would like to ask Parul Mukherji, to what extent Indian or Asiatic art and its art-knowledge relationship appears to be in principle differently organized from its Western counterpart. And if so, whether the term dividuation appears to be helpful in identifying aesthetic interferences between art practices of the Southern and Northern hemispheres. Is the term appropriate for illuminating a mutual dependency that has not previously been examined and assessed? In view of the mixing of artistic practices, does it still make sense to mark cultural origins and peculiarities? In understanding the global south, is it still important to demonstrate autochthonous knowledge and cultural autonomy? A further question, one that is also directed to Abidoun Akande. Can the term dividuation help to turn around the questions of cultural identity that are also ubiquitous in the West? Instead of a politics of diversity that plays off the individuated elements one against the other and makes skin color the basis of an argument, shouldn't we institute a politics of differential commonality? It is of individuality in order to prevent fights of everyone against everyone? How does the culture of the Yoruba, as determined by art, represent itself? To what extent can we speak of an art-knowledge relationship within it? Are you aware of interferences between Western and non-Western aesthetics in your culture? Or possibly a continued colonization by Western ideas? Finally, can restitution catalyze a new thinking in terms of aesthetic partaking? What does the return of the Benin bronzes mean for Nigeria and for the wider context? Is the world not compelled to recognize the fact that there will never be a definite decolonization, but that as the North and South become ever more closely linked, colonization will no longer take place in one direction only? So many questions for all of you. Now I try to introduce Abidoun. Abidoun, a very warm welcome to you. I'm very happy that you made it here.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was having a little problem with some.
I was figuring it out, yes.
Thank you very much.
It's even better that you made it here.
Yeah,
Abidoun Akande is a lecturer at the University of Lagos, Nigeria. His research focuses on knowledge systems in the art and cultural practices of indigenous communities and the multi-layered modernities affecting such practices in Africa. His recent publications include The Evocative Powers of Yoruba Art in 2021, Commonalities and Disparities in the Iconography of Opon, Ifa, and Iroke Ifa in Oyo, Zabe, and Ife Ana Yoruba communities. Here he compares the iconographic commonalities and divergences of Yoruba Opon Ifa and Iroke Ifa in 3 Yoruba communities in Nigeria, Benin Republic, and Togo. We can see that both colleagues, you, Abidoun, and you, Parul, are perfect partners for our topics of discussion. A very warm welcome once again to both of you, and many, many thanks that you could make it here. So, Abidoun, I think the word is yours.
Thank you very much, Michaela. I appreciate you for inviting me to join this August sitting, and I'm quite grateful. First, I really want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to contribute to the discourse on aesthetics that is going on. The topic of my paper is Beyond the Plastics, Yoruba Art as Iconography of Epistemology. The theory of derivation directs our attention to our ever-changing world and the dynamics of such changes in the continuing definition and redefinition of our individuality. The present discussion borders on the individuality of Yoruba arts as well as African arts, and this paper perceives Yoruba art as an entity of individuation, which has life of its own, and that the life of the art is defined by the prevailing socio-technological and biotechnological forces that surrounds it. The assertion of Yoruba art having life is best exemplified in Roland Abiodun's application of the Yoruba apothegm, Iwalewa, as the central principle of Yoruba aesthetic appreciation. In Abiodun's perception of Iwalewa, he looks at Iwa, that is as in existence. Right? But however, if you want to look at that word literal translation of that apothegm, you want to say behavior is beauty. Abiodun classifies art as a human entity that has beauty. However, deeper understanding of the apothegm can be interpreted as being, that is existence. Being is the essence of existence. This interpretation disparages the physical appearance of art for its essence. Rather than what it looks like, the essence becomes more important, perhaps most important. This is an important fundamental for an in-depth understanding of African art in general. And in line with this apothegm, the life of art, which also means the essence, can be said to be its very essence. The reason why an art is made is the life of the art, and it's the beauty of the art rather than what it looks like. What then is the essence of Yoruba art? One of the most important essences of Yoruba art, apart from its liturgical application for the reverence of the supreme God and spiritual body, is its iconographic reference to the epistemological repertoire of the people. The essence of Yoruba art can therefore be said to be its function as a reminder of the several experiential issues of the people and the applicable solutions to such problems. I find this position most exemplified in the Yoruba Ifa divination culture. Divination is usually carried out to find, Ifa divination is usually carried out to find solutions to individual or societal problems. And in the process of divination, the Babalawo, which is the Ifa priests, the priests in charge of Ifa, casts and permutates with several liturgical objects, such as Ike Ifa, that is Ifa palm nuts, Ajere Ifa, Ifa palm nut bowl, Iyerosu, divination powder, and Okon Ifa, Ifa divination tray. At the end of the divination session, the Babalawo arrives at one of the established 16 Odu, the verses of Ifa. Each verse in turn has other 16 verses underneath, thus making 16 times 16, which results into 256 verses altogether. The repertoire, the gamut, the Odu, is a didactic epistemological repertoire of knowledge system containing several narratives of experiential issues of Yoruba people who have lived in times past and the solution that they have applied to resolve such issues. Equally important to mention is the philosophy of knowledge embedded in the carving of Erebeji, the twin statuettes, traditional made by Yoruba, used to replace the spirit of dead twins and things like that. Then we also have Ekwegugu, the Egungun regalia, that is the masquerade regalia. These two cultures and associated concomitant art practices are pointers to the cosmological belief and indeed epistemology of the Yoruba in the existence of spirits and the conviction of the ability of the spirit to interfere with the affairs of the living, indeed to control the affairs of the living. The spirit is believed to be in charge of the affairs of the living. That is the dead, so to say, the spirit of the ancestor. While the Erebeji is used to propitiate the spirit of a dead twin in order for it not to take away the life of the living one. The Ekwegugu, which is the masquerade regalia, is used for the enactment of the visit of the spirit of a long dead ancestor to fellowship and guide the living. So the arts is a pointer to an unseen reality. It's like a material pointing to an immaterial truth. From the aforementioned point, it is deducible that beyond its plastic properties, most Yoruba arts are emblematic of particular Yoruba epistemology and are used in social, political, and religious services in the maintenance of ontological balance. Within a complex system that involves the living, that's the seen, the material, and the dead, the unseen. Individuation elements within this complex cosmological existence, therefore, combines the so identified socio-technological, and biotechnological factors with spiritual forces. However, in our becoming world, African art, with particular reference to Yoruba art, has continued to reinvent its iconography and essence as it finds its way across boundaries into museums and private collections, home and abroad, especially abroad. Worthy of attention is the changing status of African art as it continues to individuate in line with extant cultural trends and forces compendium within the new worlds where it has dispersed. Both human and non-human elements in the new worlds where Yoruba arts traveled have relabeled, they've re-identified, they've repackaged the arts to fit into prevailing extant cultural milieu in such places. I wish to refer to the several examples of Yoruba art in general, but particularly Ekwegugu, Erebeji. But in this case, let's look at Ekwegugu in museums and private collections. I intend to point out that the change of essence of Yoruba art in this situation, when it gets into the museum, in order to comprehend my illustration, we need to recognize the museum as man-invented and Western-oriented institution, and indeed a potential element of individuation that can change the status of any art that enters it. I want to even argue that the museum is indeed an installation art and an invention of the West, because every time an artwork enters it, the curator arranges and rearranges and reorganizes to pass across a theme. So it is important, also important to be informed that Yoruba Egungun in its original purpose is a paraphernalia used in the embodiment of the spirit of long gone ancestor during a ceremonial performance where the living meets with the dead. However, on the contrary, when the Eku Egungun is found within the walls of a museum, it is observed that it is usually hung static and it becomes art to be looked at. Just like traditional Western art that produced the museum, it has been individuated indeed. At this point, the Ekwegungun has in actuality changed status from an instrument of performance to an art to look at, a situation occasioned by the philosophy, the art for art's sake philosophy, and the institution, that's the museum of the West. This situation, the situation I have just described, portrays how Western philosophy and institutions, which are potential elements of the vision, have repurposed the very essence of African art. However, more flabbergasting and perhaps disorienting to the metamorphosing development to the individuating African art identity is the sudden repentant urge of the West to return African art in its possession. After African art has been individuated and seemed to be entrenching itself within the Western world, the call for reparation came. This sudden clamor for reparation raises more questions than it answers. Some of the questions it raises in my own mind is the clamor for return of African art a reflection of the remorse on the side of the West for the human treatment that had been meted out to Africa and its people during their several odious interaction and stealing of the artifacts, such as the missionary, religious annihilation, slave trade, colonialism, and currently brain drain. Again, is the West just suddenly realized, if the West just suddenly realized that most African art objects in its possession are unlawfully acquired, should they not pay penalty in addition to returning what was stolen, in emphasize, and the crimes committed in the process? And on the side of Africans, are the communities who are the original owners prepared to accept the work? Are they prepared to reincorporate the work into their system? What will happen to the works of art whose sources and owners are anonymous? And why is the clamor coming now? After all, the West has commandeered and claimed ownership of the works for centuries. So why now? These and many more questions raise suspicion about the motive of the West in returning the works of art. These are personal reflections, just like this conference allows. Then, the question then is, today, African art can be looked at as just, when the word African art is mentioned, it's a temporal terminology that implies shifting paradigms. It is capacious and encompassing. It encompasses idiosyncrasies, ambivalence, and a continuing individuation. That terminology, African art, will continue to change time after time. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Abidoun. Marita, would you take over?
Yeah, hello. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Abidoun. So my paper concerns the conditions of possibility of criticism and the limits of theory. I will start with some preliminary remarks. First, in my opinion, the philosophical presuppositions of Western aesthetics are to be found not so much in assumptions on the particularity of the person, as in a transformation of the concept of the person and of the communal. The rising of aesthetics was partially the result of a cultural transformation in the handling of communality. By this, I mean the cultural reality, e.g. the transformation of feudalism and the ramifications of the French Revolution, as well as the conceptual perception of the communal. We may define community as differing from the term society in that it indicates an understanding of the communal as a given. Instead of a contractual open regulation of the state of being together, it implies a given order, a metaphysical substance or rationality or truth, a religion, a hierarchy that assigns every single member a given place. The emergence of aesthetics can be traced to the transitional period in which this kind of community was being left behind. This placing is admittedly schematic, not only because there is never a moment that divides history into two parts, but also because the transitions are far more fluid. Some see the departure from community as taking place at the dawn of monotheism or of Greek philosophy. On the other hand, the phantasm of community plays an important role during and after the modern period, and continues to do so to this day in Western culture, e.g. in totalitarianisms and nationalisms. Notwithstanding this, the emergence of aesthetics as a discipline is related to the exit from the community. I refer to aesthetics not so much as the science of the senses, but rather the invention of the concept of art, which replaced that of the fine arts in the period after Kant, in Schiller, in Hegel, and until the era of Adorno at the very least. Art, in the singular, describes a communality as a non-given, or more precisely, as a never-given, that becomes experienceable in a sensuous element or process. Also as a cultural reality, the concept of art that is a precondition for artworks being exhibited independent of the context of their creation and of their content is an invention of the European modern era that was only retroactively projected both onto other cultures and onto Europe's past, a colonial process. Second preliminary remark. This transformation, among other factors, accompanies the non-uniform transformation of the concept of the person into the subject. The concept of the subject does not designate somebody as a given. On the contrary, it designates the potential and the obligation of each single human to become their own self, to be raised into their own self. To be oneself as a subject means, firstly, coming to oneself, relating to oneself through relating to others. Subject, in the tradition started by Kant in particular, does not understand the individual as a given in a pre-given order of the world, but nevertheless, it likewise does not understand the individual in the sense of constructivism or empiricism. The claim to a final cause persists, but as a goal. This transformation was reflected in the discipline of aesthetics, among other ways, in the conception of a mimesis without an original, and in that of self-realization as progress. The subject is not a monad and not a mere individual, but a process and a project that involves others, not others purely as factual givenness, but as being themselves in the process of becoming, as being in movement. Subject implies the principle of equality because it does not handle the self and the others as mere givenness, but as potentialities and movements. Only through this can the concept of the subject make thinkable a commonality that is not a given, for a given excludes others by definition. Third remark. As much as the concept of art implies reason, Vernunft, art means something that takes place in the element of the sensuous, Hegel, or that is inseparable from affect, Schiller. I emphasize that I do not mean that art is to be reduced to affect, but that it cannot be uncoupled from affect. For that reason, the concept of art always implies the singularity of an artwork, Hegel, or of an experience, Schiller. Kant, who does not yet think of the subject in the strong sense of a dialectic of the subject in the restricted individual sense of the object, speaks of the singularity of the judgment. In that the concept of art designates a paradox, an irreducible singularity, a sensuous process that is at the same time a communal, a universal, it does not describe a commonality as a potential addition of facts, but as a self-difference, that is, as implying or dealing with undeterminable other in oneself. It is only thanks to this singularity that the concept of art can designate a commonality, a universal, that is not a given and cannot become a given. Aesthetics thus differs from the pre-modern normative poetics of the fine arts in that it is not normative in the sense of a canon. It implies an irreducible plurality, the life of singular works that have to respond to their own present day, to their own cultural conditions, and additionally to go beyond those conditions as actualizing an irreducible difference e.g. as negativity that keeps the development of art forms in progress. I'm not making these remarks in order to refute the colonial normative delusions of aesthetics, but to emphasize the complexity of the problem. So I want to emphasize first that the problem is not surmounted by looking for a new, more appropriate terminology. If we resort to Spinoza, for instance, and describe the fluid transformations of which we are part, we today are not doing this as Spinoza did it in his time in the name of metaphysics or rationality. Because in Spinoza, it is God as immanent causality that makes thinkable these fluid transformations. If today we are inspired by Spinoza, as for example, Deleuze was, Deleuze, at least, he was speaking of Deleuze, he was inspired by Spinoza in knowledge or in acknowledging our finiteness. So neither doing a metaphysics but not also proposing a new theory that would resolve our problems. Deleuze is not proposing a new theory. And the second point I want to underline is that the problem is not surmounted by opposing the delusions of the aesthetic claim to universality with a question of identity and particularity. It is not enough to ask who is speaking, for one must also ask in the name of what is that person speaking? What category of thought enables the claim to equality? What is its condition of possibility? What is the criticism of the claim to universality founded on? What about it makes the claim of not shutting out others to be conceivable? This cannot be achieved with objections founded on facts and empiricism. The problem is, after all, involved. Suleiman Bahir Diagne argues for a decolonization that would not oppose universality with identities and particularisms, but with a new universal. He makes the case for, quote, a truly universal, the common aim of a shared emancipation, with thoughts backed up by Leibniz, Bergson, and Merleau-Ponty. He describes this concept, for instance, lateral, or as a universal of translation. With this lateral movement of translation, he references the universal that, I quote, becomes conscious of itself in translation, in the linking of, quote, ende. By contrast to Diagne, it is my opinion that today's claim to universality is no longer sustainable as a project, not least because of the now evident dark side of the Enlightenment, whose universality turned out to be the market. It is no longer sustainable as subject, as goal, as emancipation projected onto the future without betraying itself. However laterally universality may be conceived, my impression is that it cannot be a goal or a project without being colonial. For this reason, I believe that it is not a matter of proposing a new term that would function as invitation to a project, not even the term relation, but instead it is about affirming the continued persistence of the claim to an ever-given communal as praxis and dedicating oneself to it. Judith Siegmund speaks of a wanting to connect or will to connect. That which engages in connection, I see not only as connection of judgments of others, but as the movement, the desire of our existence itself, the relationship that we are by virtue of going beyond ourselves. To dedicate oneself to this relating in full acknowledgement of our finiteness, our inability to take over a universality, our inability to be fully autonomous, means to stand for places or moments in which this praxis of relating, Nancy calls it with, or might even call it individuation, or whatever we might call it, can appear as such, each time at a precise point, singularly and finitely, rather than a vertically projected common horizon. Irreducible opacities, untranslatable singularities, points, moments, or places in which we devote ourselves to a free flowing of the praxis of relating, even if this takes place within the totality of the market and in knowledge of the limits even of the concept of relating that I have outlined here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Parul, for the last presentation.
Yeah, I wanted to thank Michaela for inviting me to be part of this very stimulating discussion. And I must also add that I'm the only one who is not a philosopher. I'm more of an art historian with a lot of interest in philosophy. So I will be talking about an other or our aesthetic knowledge. We are in it together. The common in public sphere, especially in aesthetics, has a long history stretching back to Kant's third critique. Sensus communis, as he proposed, had an implicit democratic potential of allowing everyone access to an aesthetic experience. But in art history, the sensus communis ended up planting the seeds of a formalist aesthetics. Art critics like the English art critic Roger Fry at the end of 20th century could still insist that formalism as a method of appreciating art was open to all, an argument that he made for modern art as such. He proposed, following Kantian logic, that to appreciate modern art, one could finally lay aside all the cultural baggages of the past and solely rely on one's eyes. Modern art in this sense was seen as individual, as in a participatory sense, a potential equalizer, as everything in the world, from Persian carpets to Indian temple sculptures to Benin bronzes, etc., could be visually translated in terms of color, lines, figure, ground, stone, bronze, etc. From a post-colonial perspective, such a claim allowed the bypassing of the cultural context of these alien objects, and as Achille Mbembe points out, for the Kantian justification of not wanting to know the difficult terrain of other cultures and the beliefs and so on. Visuality in this sense became the defining feature of art history, through which epistemic violence of formalism found acceptance. Ironically, this seeing to know in one's own terms, or the power of visuality, also came into question when art history broadened its remit and evolved into visual studies in more recent times. With each shift came along the question of audience, which became increasingly diverse, seeming to pose a challenge to Eurocentric concepts of aesthetics and public sphere. Gaius Spivak's A Critique of Post-Colonial Reason becomes very relevant to this context, a book through which I introduce Kant and Hegel to my students. I draw from her the strategy of planting a native informant on the margins of Kant's third critique as an example. Now, this native informant may be imagined as asking individual questions to these canonical philosophers in such a way that marginal figures leap to the foreground and help us to grasp the same text as a dialogue between these Enlightenment philosophers and their overlooked others. What was earlier read as a monologue could turn into a two-way conversation now that you can hear the other side. So Iroquois Sachem, the Native American chief, speaks back. So does the Negro within quotes, the Chinaman, and the others in the text. What will these others speak back to Kant? That it is fine to appreciate Paris through its food stalls, that Black Lives Matter, that it is fine for a bushman to run away from a volcano without being called primitive, that art criticism had a much longer history in China than even Hegel could fathom. Much has been commented and discussed within post-colonial studies about epistemic violence that has shaped the institutionalization of aesthetics as a discipline and the relationship between the global south and the global north, one of which has been the charge of derivativeness. that is often flung at artists, art critics, curators from the global south. That certain conceptual tools in aesthetics have had a provenance in Europe, and methods that have individual authorship, like Hegelian historicism or Kantian formalism, aesthetics, and so on. How does one from the global south respond to these charges of derivativeness? In the context of post-colonial art history aesthetics, one response has been to insist on retooling the available conceptual tools to ask very different questions. Can the rules of formal analysis, as for example, be applied to non-Western art to ask new questions, to bring out its own aesthetic principles? The desire to rebut the claims of derivativeness led me to revisit a 10th century discourse on aesthetics called Rasa by an Indian philosopher and aesthetician, Abhinav Gupta. His aesthetic theory resonates more with this individual figure that we're talking about, where aesthetic experience is defined as transcending the limited I-ness of individual experience. He proposes to do this via the concept of what is called in Sanskrit, sadharanikarana, or generality, that must rise above the individual to enable a shared aesthetic experience, where the aesthete is called rasika or sahridaya, which literally means of the same heart, does not own an emotion, but rises up above the limited individual identity to participate in a shared collective experience. It almost presages by a millennium the turn that contemporary art has recently taken to address community-based participatory art experience, though in a totally different cultural context. It would be reactionary for me to stop here in a celebration of rich, native aesthetic discourse of 10th centuries. A move made by many a cultural nationalist to assert India's self-reliance, or what in the currently ruling government circle is called Atmanirbharta, again a Sanskrit term called self-reliance. Now the same text, when read from a feminist lens, reveals its own internal epistemic violence of caste and gender-based discrimination, under which not everyone had equal access to such lateral aesthetic experience. In other words, the pre-modern aesthetic theories do not translate well into the modern context and its ideal of democratic citizenship. It's here I would like to make a distinction between the post-colonial discourse and that of decolonization. Post-colonial critiques of Western art and aesthetics face the trap of recanonizing the canonized. Despite the best efforts to dismantle the master's house, so to speak, the vertical structures continue to thrive. Hence my lament that even after decades of post-colonial critique, we are still grappling about epistemic inequities. And this relates directly to Michaela's tantalizing question. To what extent the accusation of epistemic imperialism still applies today? Unfortunately, it still applies in our times, though in a covert sense. At the moment, I'm involved in a project of writing art history for the present. It involves art historians from both the hemispheres, global south and global north. And it's proved to be such an immense challenge as how to radically rethink the narrative logic of art history in a decolonizing mode. How to depart from a vertical to a lateral narrative. In many recent world art history books that pretend to write lateral, inclusive histories, there's a persistence of verticality often betrayed by the manner in which the unmarked Eurocentric art histories remain the core around which are overlaid these marked narratives of the others. It's here that I feel compelled to make a distinction between the post-colonial discourse and that of decolonization. The post-colonial discourse is increasingly betraying the limits of using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, an era that decolonization must not repeat. The challenge is to reject these tools and forge new ones, but can completely new ones be forged? That's a big question. How does this translate into an art history writing project? In contemporary art, owing to the digital turn, there are rich lateral conversations and non-hierarchical interactions across nations and hemispheres. But history writing project moves on unheeded. The post-colonial discourse have been most successful in critiquing the canonized artworks, but its long-standing impact has been to further recenter the canon. And at the end of the day, it is business as usual. The shifts in history writing, for it to be structural and not cosmetic, a more radical step of revamping the narrative needs to be taken. Perhaps by letting in unfamiliar objects that defy easy translation into known terms. With that, I would argue for slowness or difficulty of comprehension as an enabling condition for a lateral historical narrative to emerge. It's here that the individualism model urges me to think otherwise along the horizontal axis. I see in it a provocation of preparing ourselves for slow translations, entering into difficult thickets of translatability. This is a shared difficulty. And it's not that being from South Asia, it concerns me more than those from the Northern Hemisphere. Decolonization offers a new paradigm for the common. Decolonization is not only about those nations which have a history of colonization, but implicates others too, as the whole planet is still grappling with the consequences of an unwieldy modernity. Since there is no planet B, it brings on the recognition that in this we're all together. In a way, individuation then becomes both an inescapable and an eloquent condition that prepares ground for collaboration and a fuller participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. I mean, we agreed before to open the floor for everyone now, but maybe we should take an internal round first. I don't know what you think, or should we just invite all the viewers in to the discussion at this point? I don't want to make that decision myself, so.
Christian, I would propose that the person who wants to ask a question should do it, either us or somebody else. Both is fine with me.
But the question is whether we have a panel with everyone as participants, or whether they remain in the background and have to write in the Q&A.
I would say we should open it because we have not such a lot of time anymore.
Yes, yes, I agree.
Okay. Well, Lorenzo, could you then invite everyone in? But we already have a first someone who wants to say something. Marita, please. Oh, and please, once everybody's in, please do not raise your hand, but write something in the chat, just an X or a star or something. So I can also see the order of people who want to say something. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I would like to ask a question. Thank you for the beautiful talks. Yeah, I would like to ask a question to Abidoun. If I would like to ask him if I've understood him correctly. So he was saying that Yoruba art is having a life of its own, articulated with socio and biological forces. The word he's using for articulated is dividuation, yeah, dividuating, yeah. So, but he's saying that Yoruba art was having originally in its original context the role of an ontological balance between the living and the dead, between spirits and socio and biological forces. And he says that when it is articulated or dividuated in Western museum, with Western museums, etc., it kind of, I'm not sure if I understood him correctly, it kind of what is colonial to him is that it loses this something irreducible to their articulations, and it was exactly this spiritual dimension. So that if I understood him correctly, he's saying that there is something in Yoruba art that is irreducible to it, although it is living, and so it is being articulating and individuating, so articulating and changing at the same time as a living thing. There is something irreducible to it. Have I understood correctly or not?
Should I go ahead and answer that, please?
Yes.
Please, yes.
Yeah, what I actually said at that point is that Yoruba art, just like every other art around the world, is changing status as it goes into one culture, moves from one culture to another, as it crosses geographical boundaries. And this individuation thing, just like the last speaker said, we are all, the second to the last speaker said, we're all in it together. It's something that is going to engulf all of us, because if it continues to change, and that is happening everywhere, because when you look at Western art, want to look at what Yinka Shonibare said recently in his ongoing exhibition, how Picasso used African art to affect European art. It's not a one-way thing. Everywhere is getting individuated. I mean, I don't know if I've answered your question at all.
Parul has a question.
Yeah. In fact, I was just struck by very interesting, how do I say, a contradiction or a tension between two papers of two panelists over here. One is, in Abidoun's paper, there was a very rhetorical, very passionate argument to go beyond the plastic, right? To go beyond the form, because really that restricts the understanding of meaning of that artwork. And if I move to Judith's paper, this is the precise point that Judith makes about the need to bring back the question of production aesthetics, where materiality becomes crucial. Condition under which art is produced becomes actually very important question to raise. So I just want you to comment on this interesting contradiction that I see here.
What do you think? What is it a contradiction, or what is the relationship? What do you think?
Perhaps relationship is a better word than contradiction, yes.
Yeah.
Because it shows us two different paths, two different trajectories of thinking about materiality.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to actually get that question straight. I'm talking about art, that the essence, the life of the art is indeed more important than the art. And I will cite an example. I traveled to Togo at a point in time, and I observed that works of art that are used in the continuation of culture, of Yoruba culture outside the original homeland of Yoruba people, that is the Yoruba in the diaspora, in the immediate diaspora, let me put it that way, along the West African coast. They're using things that are not conventional, but the culture continues. And that means it is the essence of the art. If it looks like what it should, if it does not look like what it should be, it doesn't matter, but what purpose is it serving? That's where I bring in essence as being over and above plastic. I don't know if I'm, but I don't get what you said, she said, Marita said. So that's what I said. And that's what I meant, really.
So I try to answer your interesting question. Could be that the perspective of the, if you want to theorize the perspective of the artists in this talk, then the perspective would or could always be the use of that what you produce, what you make, and with you, what do I mean with use? I was wondering about the concept of essence. I was always thinking about what do you mean with the essence of Yoruba art, because what is that essence? What is it? And in this way, in relationship to that, you could say theorizing the production side of art. It's a kind of thinking about the essence, means also about the way in which the art should be used, but that also means you have not the whole power to for example, to let the art in the one culture in which it is, or the artwork, it is used in the way in which the artist prefer it, and if the artwork change the culture, then it's used in another way and you have no influence anymore on it. But I would say I try to explain it with that example from Kant's Palace, that the interesseloses Wohlgefallen from Kant, it's grounded of that non-information about, or not interest in who builds a palace. And I think there are some relationship, who made something for what, and how important is the fixation, or how important is it not, if it's more performance, and what take place if this comes into the museum, for example. Then, so that means you can also speak in this here from a dialogue, not from the intercultural dialogue, but from the dialogue from people who are different related to the arts as a fields. So that would be my answer.
I have a question in the chat that I could read by Ines Kleesattel, directed towards Parul Mukherji's question concerning an aesthetics of production. I was also wondering, how do you as theorists relate to your considerations within your practices of thinking, writing, and discussion? Being producers of something as well, I guess, is what this means.
Yeah, should I respond?
Sure.
So the materiality can actually have very different valence, because the reason why I asked that question to Judith is because very often I find in Kantian aesthetics a certain kind of narcissism. It's like everything revolves back to the self. So even your interaction with a beautiful object is reflecting on your own, your own subjectivity, formation of subjectivity. Whereas the materiality of object is something which allows you to break out of that kind of self-obsession and deal with the other, material as the other. So that has something which has really kept me very interested in how there is this both attachment to materiality, because remember, Kant always insists on underlining the singularity of aesthetic experience. It's that flower, it's that work of art. It can't be a general group of flowers or group of art objects, but that singular object. So there's both that how do I say, movement towards the self, and at times he kind of feels compelled to break out of self and then deal with the other.
Christian? Christian, I have a question.
Sorry, my mic was off. Yes, Michaela.
Okay, thank you all for the questions and the answers. I would like to come back to the question of the communal, because this is our hidden topic, let's say. Therefore, we invited guest speakers in order to know if there is a communal of all of us, or a communal understanding of the communal, or is there a possible praxis which could bring us closer together? As far as I understood you, Parul, and you, Abidoun, you sketched a specific, let's say, indigenous or cultural communal, which you are also criticizing, Parul, as far as I understood. Also in Germany, we have certain tendencies for the communal, for a nationalist communal, which is a big problem. But besides that, if we think in terms of art production or art praxis, would you think that in the long run, since all art production nowadays is somehow a mixed production, is taking up influences from the outside and gets more and more hybrid or individuated, as I would say. Would you say this brings us closer to a communal understanding, or is this just a dream, again, a Western dream of being together apart? That's my question. It's to Abidoun and to Parul mainly.
Well, it's like being together apart is something that nobody can run away from. We're together, yet we're apart. We share commonalities as human beings. You live there, I live here. And then the peculiarities will come in. The issue of individuation, like I said, it's something that is compelling. It's not optional. Already, the world is getting individuated day by day with the technological, the relationship here and there. One thing is sure, that we're going to have common grounds and we're going to have disparities at one point or the other. That's why I said African arts, because of the influences, just like the art of everywhere, is going to be temporal. The word African art is temporal. It's shifting. It's something that will continue to change as the world itself changes.
Okay, thank you.
So, Michaela, very interesting and how do I say, very sort of thought-provoking question you raised. My answer, it's not very easy to answer that kind of complex question, but I'll just try. You know, I often feel that there is a disjunction between the way art practice is going, contemporary art practice. That's precisely where there is a lot of decentering happening. There's a lot of kind of work which there's a possibility of individual thinking through perhaps engagement with materiality and so on. But when it comes to art discourse, it seems to kind of lag behind. It's not able to keep up with the very progressive thinking we often come across in contemporary art. And I often wonder at what is the reason behind this disjunction, that they don't carry forward in a same pace. You know? And that is perhaps when artists are dealing with, that's why Judith's whole question of production aesthetics is very important, because contemporary artists are able to break out of certain ideological baggage because of their close involvement with materiality of practice, which is able to give them that avenue of thinking differently. Whereas when it comes to art critical writings, the historical baggage seems to be weighing heavier, and many exciting questions which are possible in art practice somehow are not being asked within critical practice of art writing.
So you would say in our aesthetic praxis, we are closer to each other than in our way of thinking and of categorizing.
Yeah, sort of, yes.
Question from the
Thank you.
audience. Lisa, you would like to take the floor?
Yes. Hello, everybody. I have a question. No, it's not a question. Actually, I have a comment to make, and it's regarding Parul's question of that relationship between the life of art and the production aesthetics. And actually, it's good to continue, like to point out what I want to say right now, because she's just also saying like what has not been asked, or where is the different, let's say, the differentiating moment in approaching the subject matter. And I have a feeling, being having studied sciences and philosophy, but being a practicing artist and nowadays, it's about the language, and we can talk about different kinds of languages. And I have a feeling that there is in the life of art an emotional language that is also a language of experiencing, whereas in in really thinking material, or the act of producing, as well as the act of producing discourse, so to speak, is more a cognitive language and thus a language of understanding. And maybe there is a difficulty, because within the framework of an understanding, we need to have knowledge, whereas in the framework of experiencing, we only have to surrender. And it's a different approach of gaining, let's say, of gaining this experience into one's own self. I really enjoy that. I have to say, Parul, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody. I really enjoy exactly this fire that is lit for me between the production aesthetics and the life of art, because there is something that we in German would always call Leiblichkeit that goes within the language of experience. I also am a performance artist, so maybe that like brings me closer to the bodily aspects. But we always experience within the body also. So I have a feeling that the production aesthetics have more a tendency to what I would then call cognitive language, or language of understanding. Back to all of you. Thank you.
Would anyone like to respond directly?
So I ask myself, in what relationship it's what Lisa said to the title of the Congress. Did you put the cognitive thing on the side of the sciences, Lisa, or did I wrong understood?
I would say not sciences as such. Not sciences as such. It's more a way of practicing. Like when we, for example, say like art is thinking, then the artist is working a lot like a child, to my mind. Maybe I'm going a bit far right now, but is often working as a child, where you really do go with a trial and error. Whereas if you really, there's a different approach to my mind when I just start my trial and error investigations, or when I really try to focus on a specific material, specific product, specific material. Actually, like when I want to do a sculpture, it's a different approach. What I especially like and how that, like, no, it's a different, I have a feeling it's a different language when I use, let's say, concrete, what concrete says to different people on this planet, so to speak, and what that kind of language can be, because I have a feeling it's more, since it will be a language that will be more disparate from my body, I have a feeling we can make it more universal to an understanding, but with that distant understanding. That's why I say language of understanding. Whereas if I experience something, as we are all human, I would say that, of course, we have our cultural imprints and everything, but in the experience, like in that very moment, like a surprise, for example, that feeling of feeling surprised, like the feeling as such will be the same. I don't know if you get me here. Like it will be a longer discussion. Since you both are in Zurich, we can continue here, but I hope you get me.
And there's a comment from the audience on that. Ines Kleesattel.
Please.
I'm not so sure if it's a comment on what you, Lisa, just said, but what you said before, because you brought up language. So if someone wants to respond right now. No. So I would like to take up on the language part also, because Michaela, again, you know on what I'm going to hint, but because you mentioned Glissant, and what I find so inspiring about Glissant is that one can read him neither as a poet nor a theorist without the other. He is always both. And I feel like what he is using language, obviously, but in a poetical way that is also a very theoretical way. And it is not to be separated. And this also gets me back to the question of production aesthetics as a question concerning aesthetic theory. I mean, what are we doing here as theorists, and where can we learn differently? And I understood the question of post-colonial discourse versus, or on the other hand, the necessity to decolonize the practices we do as theorists. And there I feel maybe it isn't, sometimes I wonder if it's so helpful to really work so strongly with the art, discourse, concept, art field, whatever, also because Parul, Mukherji, you were referring to the involvement with the material. And I am a bit thinking, I mean, what Glissant is, he's also writing about art sometimes, or aesthetic phenomena, but he is also writing about what I would call nature, even though this is a very difficult concept as well. But again, then why are we never as aesthetic, or as far as I know, almost never as aesthetic theorists talk about aesthetic experience of nature? Or I mean, it's still very much in my westernized conceptions of art aesthetics and nature aesthetics, but I'm just searching or wondering, are there ideas or are there practices where we can learn from? And also I think this idea of the artwork as or art as something with a life of its own, how can we get involved as theorists as well into this material, or in a way that allows us to theorize not so much about, but within? And I mean, are there considerations? Is there something, I mean, also maybe Michaela, you could go on a bit with Glissant, maybe there is something or whatever. Thank you.
Thank you, Ines, for your question, but I think the research into language material is a rich one. And unfortunately, we are all bound to speak English and we cannot talk in 10 different languages. This is a restriction, of course, and it's also a colonial attitude somehow to always speak this Western language. But on the other hand, I think bringing about concepts and ways of thinking, and also what Marita did, she sketches a sort of a movement, no, an endless movement towards a becoming subject, which will never be ended or realized in a way. This is also an artistic thinking in my understanding. So I would not like to play body versus knowledge or versus mind. I think we have to combine it, and I would not know nor Parul nor Abidoun if I was not interested in other cultures. And while this is the thing to do, we have to find out where we can mix, where we can find communal things together, and this needs knowledge as well as intuition and creative practices and so forth, I would say. And since you as you know, I appreciate very much Edouard Glissant, but he's the one to tell us that the different articulations are always in tension. No, they are not homogenized. They cannot be homogenized. We have to keep them apart in order to see what is different also within what we bring together. And I think this is important. So, and this is only possible if you keep up different knowledge systems or different articulation systems. So I'm very much into differentiation, also by language, I have to say. Thank you.
I have a question following up on this, maybe. In the title of our panel, we have the concept of the aesthetic, and the question whether the aesthetic is a European concept or whether it can be universal one still, or a transcultural one. In the discussion now, we've mostly talked about art, and it's the question really concerns the relation between the terms aesthetic and art, because they're obviously not identical, and people have been arguing that art is a European concept, and like as I understood you, Abidoun, or no, what you really said was that looking at these artifacts aesthetically, only taking their appearance instead of what you call their essence, would be to look at them aesthetically. And this would be to reduce them to something that they're not, or to transform them into something that they're not meant to be, which would mean that the aesthetic is not a universal category, but we did use the word art and works of art. On the other hand, you could argue that art is not a universal category, but very much European-centered. And so, I mean, you could switch back and forth between the categories, or you could abandon them both. But what would you be left with then is the question. And it is a real question for me. And I think it's like when you say, again, Abidoun, when you said, okay, as soon as something enters, as soon as a work of art enters the museum, and in a way you could say, well, I mean, it is not a work of art before it enters the museum. It is a material artifact produced in a cultural context, but then it enters the museum and it is turned into a work of art. But that is the problem precisely. So is art really the universal concept that we can rely on to talk about all of this? Or is aesthetics the universal concept that we can rely on? Or is it neither? And how do we deal with this kind of conflict?
Thank you. This is interesting. When I would rather prefer to use the word transform rather than reduce, because looking at dividuation as a theory and applying it, we're not looking at reduction. Rather, my perception of dividuation is one that an object is transformed. It changes, how do I call it now? It changes its, I don't want to call it its usage, its application. Then it has, due to forces prevailing in the new milieu which has entered, then it has, then we're talking of transformation rather than reduction. And I don't want to see it as reduction in any way, because I don't want to say, saying one is reducing is like one is entering from a higher culture to a lower culture or something like that. No, it gets transformed. And now, looking at the word art, well, art, no doubt about it, is a Western language. Yoruba does not have the word art in its diction. There is no word like art, but we don't have a choice other than to discuss, because the entire process we are in right now, we're talking about a universal language. We're looking at something that we all have in common, and we must use a language that we share. We don't have a choice. Yoruba word has honor. There is honor. Honor may mean decoration. Honor may mean, well, some form of arts, but not essentially the kind of art you call art in Europe. Decoration is sheer honor. It could refer to all forms of things that appear, that are manipulated by man to achieve a particular form, to achieve form and things like that. So the word art, yeah, already we are getting there. Like I said, at every point we get divided because we are together, and we have to relate, and we must use the language. Arts, Yoruba also has its own aesthetic terminologies that apply to Yoruba artists, especially traditional Yoruba artists. We have so many of them. One very good one, if you're in Germany, is Iwalewa. I mean, you have Iwalewa house there at Beirut. And when you talk about Iwalewa, that's an aesthetic terminology. That is Iwalewa, the essence, the being, existence. I mean, being, your very essence tells us about the reality of your being there, because that's one of the terminologies, and we have a whole lot of them, but different art types, art genre, have their own aesthetic terminologies, which some of them have similarities with those of the West, and a few of them don't. But the very word art is something that is not in Yoruba terminology and in many African communities terminology, because art, like you look at it in a Western sense, art to look at. Art is not meant to be looked at. There are some art in some African cultures, there are some arts that are not put outside at all, like the Eku Egungun, the masquerade regalia that are put in museums all over, even in Nigeria, in Africa, everywhere. They are not meant to be seen when they are not in performance, when they are not in usage. Some art are not meant to be seen. Even there are some among the Baule by Susan Vogel's, in one of Susan Vogel's writing, that there are some arts that are produced not to be seen at all. They are for personal worship, not to be seen by people, not meant for public consumption. And
Okay.
I think I must have said a few things. Thank you very much.
Parul, please.
Yeah, I would just like to respond to Christian's that very provocative question about whether a work of art is art from the non-Western context, if it's non-art before it enters the museum context. And I would very much like to argue that there is a possibility of arguing that it is art before it enters the museum context, but in terms which are very dissimilar, because I mean, one can always go to aesthetic discourses written at that time when that art was produced, something which has been sidelined, not much work has gone into it, but that really needs to be looked at, which is why I've been very interested in going back to pre-modern aesthetic theories, which have been kind of not been engaged with thoroughly. And then I would like to go back to I think Ines's question about the post-colonial and a number of other issues which have come up. But I want to underline how do I say, the difficulty of being a post-colonial, because in my own understanding, I was first familiar with Hegel and Kant's aesthetics before I got interested in pre-modern aesthetic theories. And it was because of that provocation that led me towards, so this is the irony of being a post-colonial. And that's when this whole question of nature aesthetics, which was also a question which was raised. And one had to go back, keep going back to the Indian context, and then go back to the Kantian context, and then find out how anthropocentric some of these ideas of aesthetics are. Because, you know, as Hegel very clearly says, that the category of art is higher than that of nature. So the reason why you're interested in art is because it's meant for human consumption. It's not, you know, there may be a beautiful flower growing in the forest, but that is not going to count as art. And then after that, you come back to other alternative definition of aesthetics, where the world of nature, birds and bees who have ability to put together, even weave together a nest, which is a very deliberate act of choosing the right material to create that nest, is also seen as an aesthetic act. So there's kind of broadening of that whole anthropocentric understanding of aesthetics, which tends to remain very human-centered.
I have another question from the audience, Jörg Sternagel.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. Yeah, I was just thinking about, I mean, within this discussion, and I really appreciate this discussion, if we want to go beyond, or if we want to, let's say, achieve new ways of thinking, wouldn't it be, I think, also fruitful to go beyond Western philosophy, and also by doing that, to be critical with that? I mean, there are a lot of, there's a lot of work in post-colonial studies, especially in the 1980s, that is also very critical with Deleuze, for example, or with Foucault, and that wants to especially go beyond post-Kantian thought, and I was also thinking about wouldn't be another way to think, like François Julien is doing that, going back to ancient Chinese philosophy when he's interested into dialogues with China, for example. So this is just a direction where I'm just heading to, well, at least to be critical with the Western philosophers with whom we have been working for so long. But shouldn't there be at least an approach to also be critical with that, like it's the case in post-colonial studies for a long time? So yeah.
And in this case, you don't just mean Kant, you mean Foucault and Deleuze as well.
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. Yeah.
Michaela?
So I mean, for example, think about Spivak, Can the Subaltern Speak? I mean, she's criticizing Deleuze and Foucault. Just a thought.
Yeah. Jörg, you might know that I'm not only criticizing Kant, but also Deleuze and others in my book.
I know. Sure,
No? Of course, we have to deconstruct or to criticize our heritage, but nevertheless not give it up totally or renounce on creating knowledge, I would say. No, we have to find out what other concepts or knowledge parameters are important in order to get into the other or with the other somewhere. Already the term other is difficult, and nevertheless we use it and we need to use it and so forth. And we want to dis other on the one hand, and on the other hand we are forced to speak in a way which we would not, which we would prefer not to. So I think different movements are important, of course, no? And
yes, of course, but also being
heritage, yes.
Yeah, but also being critical with the heritage. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yes.
Parul.
Can I respond to you, Sternadels? Interesting question. You know, for me, I would respond by saying that it's very crucial for me to go along with relational thinking and not in terms of, oh, let's go back to the pure sort of traditional thinking and all, because that's the danger that I'm facing in the current national scenario. It's precisely what the government wants us to do, is let's go back to pure Indian values, which are untouched, uncontaminated by the West. And that is what is very frightening, which I counter by saying that I want to really work in such a way that I'm able to keep the relation so that it can do a double gesture of deconstruction, not only deconstruct your own so-called native context, but also the context from which you are referring to.
We have somehow we have the same problem here, Parul, because nowadays we are even accused of speaking in a too academic way, you know, and we are asked to speak in a simple way. And this is somehow the same. You should speak not in the differentiated way which we are trained in, voluntarily trained ourselves, because we think it's a progress or something fruitful. And now we are accused of being superior, and we are asked to give up this position of being ones who know, let's say. Yeah.
There are two more questions in the chat. Zhuofei Wang.
Hello?
Hello?
I have no questions.
Just go ahead.
Yeah, I have no questions. I only want to give a comment. I like to add a perspective from East Asia to the relationship between artistic and non-artistic activities. In East Asia, daily activities that might be excluded from European art history have long been an integral part of aesthetic and artistic experience. In traditional Chinese culture, artistic forms such as calligraphy, tea ceremony, theater playing, and the Go game were actually part of daily activities. In Japanese art of living is also connected with the daily life. Traditionally, there is in Japan no significant difference between elegant art and craft. Instead, the experience of elegant art is constantly merged with the daily experience.
Thank you.
That's all. Thank
There's a comment or a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to say it directly or should I just read it? Okay, I read it. At Marita, Tatari, and all the others, if they wish, would you like to comment on Hans-Georg Gadamer's claim that it is a common interest in things in which we meet? Right? A common interest in things in which we meet, or what?
I don't quite understand what means it. I mean, if the person would like to explain a little bit, it's a long time. I read Gadamer the last time. I can't remember. I don't remember. What is it? It is a common interest in things in which we meet. I don't understand this part.
Okay. Hello. I don't know. You can't see my picture, I think, but maybe you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. In this discussion, well, no, I start differently. I would like to rely to what you said about the free floating of relations and which you put against universalism. And as far as I understood Hans-Georg Gadamer, he claimed that it is always that we wonder about things, what is it to live this way or the other way, that we are always interested in certain questions, and that this is kind of a universalism, but he would always answer it differently, and our conversation about it kind of, as far as I understand it, is kind of floating, but as we rely to relate to something we are interested in, that this is a point we meet. And I just wondered when you talked about the free floating, in which point is the free floating something where people meet in your concept? And I wondered how it relates to the way I understand Gadamer.
Thank you. Well, so I did criticize the universalism, but I didn't meet. I do think that it is necessary to stand for a common that is not given, that is, and it can never be given in some way. So this can be also called universalism. But what I do think that what I do think that is not possible anymore is the autonomy of the subject, like the taking over of this universalism. So what I try to underline is the knowledge about our limits and the finiteness, and this also a knowledge about the limits of theory. So I don't see myself in the position of proposing a new theory. I do think that even this position is problematic. Putting it to say now all the Western philosophy is bad and now we will propose a new theory. I do think that if we do that, then we really have to think a lot about what enables this theoretical position. So what does it mean to stand for a common that is not given, in acknowledgement of the fact that we cannot take it over, let's say. It's like moments where we can think the common as a free emanation of relating, like what happens in some moments. And it is, well, Nancy thinks it like that, in fact. So it is the autonomy, but not the autonomy of a subject. Is more like the autonomy of moments of relating that cannot be taken over by an instance. And what it is about making room, let's say, or standing for the existence of such moments or such places. I don't know if I answer. I don't exactly know how Gadamer sees it. He's a bit too close to Heidegger to not be thinking that in somehow in a horizon of history. So because yeah. I don't know if I'm answering.
Yeah, thank you. I just wondered whether the point of relation is the point where two people in a conversation understand something together, and I wondered whether the point.
It might be this, it might be whatever, but the point is that this understanding is non-conclusive. It's like, a matter of fact, I see myself also close to Glissant and his concept of totality, because he does speak about totality as something that is singular. And he speaks about relation while he insists on opacity. So it might be something that happens between two people. It might be whatever. It might be a gestus. It might be something that touches in some. It might. It is not predefined what it can be.
Yeah, thank you. The common which is created in a moment or happens.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Michaela.
I think this is exactly what we try to do here, no? To get together, being together apart, and looking for something which could be a common or commonality for all of us, which of course we will never reach, but maybe which we reached for single moments, as you said, Marita. Now this is probably the only thing we can do for the moment being. Nevertheless, I hope we will get together again and continue this talk. And yeah, I would like to thank everybody for having participated in this being together apart.
Yeah, I would like only to add two things. I think this being apart is very important because in my understanding, it is this which that enables that a relation can flow. There must be something that is not in the relation for relation to be this floating. Otherwise, it is relation from A to B. There must be something that is not relation for relation to be. It must be relation relating to, or if we speak about it on the terms of translation, it is translation that deals with the untranslability in it somehow. So yeah.
There's difference, of course, yes.
But
can I add only one sentence?
We have a few minutes left. Yes, please.
Yes, but the question is, who decides when this moment comes? So I think the history of colonialism is also that one side only decided when the rich moment was there. So there's also the question: is this moment only for a special view or feeling, or that is, or could it also be that you define the autonomy of the moment, and there is only there for yourself and not for the other, because it's a question who has to define it. That is I think a difficulty.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say that it's a product of a decision completely, even if there is some decision in letting it happen, but I wouldn't say that I wouldn't see it as something that results from an intention and the decision. That's how I understand the finiteness, let's say. But of course, it's not. Yeah.
Maybe we give the word back to our guest speakers. Would you like to provide a last comment or a remark or something?
Yeah. May I speak, please? Yeah, I think when the moment comes, when this commonality is about to happen, it's something that is not going to be one person dominating the other, and it's going to happen naturally, and it is happening, and it will continue to happen. Like, I want to see the works of Picasso being appreciated using African art language. I want to see works done in Africa using European art style. I want to see them appreciated with Western art language, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. Parul,
You're
a
muted.
non-conclusive remark?
I said Abidoun has put it so beautifully that I'm left speechless. Thank you for that.
Okay, then let's hope that we are going to meet again, not in a too far future. And I wish you all the best. I know that the situations in your countries are difficult as well as in ours, but not at that point, I suppose. The commonality is not common again, as far as I understand, and there are power relations and all sorts of complications, which Judith pointed out some moments ago. So let's hope that we still can fight for becoming closer to each other. I would very much appreciate it. Okay, all the best to everybody, and thanks a lot, Christian, for the moderation, and have a good day.